She brought my class cut off on a field trip.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I should do some hand signals. Okay. Welcome to the Center for Urban Education. I appreciate you all for being here. I'm Derek Heck. I am one of the graduate research and teaching associates here in the center, and it gives me lots of pleasure to invite you to this place. I understand that we are at the end of a busy semester, and so many of you are wrapping up projects and looking forward to the semester coming to its rightful close. And so I hope that you all have all of the energy and resources to reach whatever goals you have set for yourselves for the semester. So I wanted to share that. Allow me to make a few brief introductions. We are under the direction of Dr. Elon Dancy. Who is new to the center but not new to the work. And so we appreciate having him, his energy, and his leadership here. And we're also very fortunate to have Dr. Dana Thompson-Dorsey, Dr. Erica Kessler, Dr. Connor, Dr. Alvin Pierman, Kenny Donaldson, Beth Sondell, Dr. Beth Sondell, and Amy Witherspoon. So we have we think in our own Cassia in the back who's capturing many of our events. I know she worked for the school, but you know, this is really her point. So we're happy to have all of you all here and happy to have this body of people who are committed to the work. I want to say a few things about Dr. Amanda Godley. This is the reason for which you come. And I'll just say she's busy. And I could stop there. But I'll talk about her really briefly, her academic collaborations within the school, across campuses, and across the country. And she's busy doing the work, whether it's the efforts shown with AER-funded research or National Science Foundation mid-career grants that she's been awarded. She is very, very busy. And I've seen her always doing, rarely sitting, on her way to more doing. And I've seen her in spaces where she's been very much so fully engaged in the activity of the moment, and I've seen that engagement pivot to the next thing. I can recall being in this space where we were engaging some critical piece of literature, and then she turned, as that was ending, to talk about politics and rallying people around who should be the candidate and how can we organize. And so she's always busy doing the work. And as someone who is learning from models of how you might behave in academia, I'm very fortunate to say that your busyness matters, and I appreciate that. And I want to bring you to the nature of her work, particularly around the topic of, her new book. And I'll say it like this. I ain't going to take a whole lot of time talking about her work, because I want to let you get schooled and figure out how you can get put on. She finna let y'all peep game and keep it all the way 100 about how she knows that when they be saying stuff like the way they be saying it, it's full of intellect. It's hella smart. Matter of fact, it's brilliant as you know what. Just because it don't sound like what you used to, that don't mean it don't mean the same thing. Now we've got some students who speak like this, talk like that on a regular basis, and we have many teachers and educators who assign a level of intellect because of that expression of a dialect and that code and that language. And Amanda's work really speaks to what I would say the core of it is, if I can see myself in it, perhaps I can be it. If I can see myself reflected in it, perhaps I can master it. And I'll add that I don't think that those are the questions that ought to be posed. I think we all have seen and heard the bodies of research that talk about the richness of culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching. I think those questions have already been answered, and I think your work continues to add to that conversation. But the work I think that needs to be talked about, in addition to this critical work, is what are the reasons for which people thwart this work? How do we disrupt that? Who benefits from denying the intellect of someone who doesn't sound like they are masters of the King's English? Who benefits from that language and that rhetoric? And I think that's the next step beyond this work. And so I appreciate your scholarship, and thank you for being busy. Now, the floor is yours.
I'm going to match that introduction. Wow. Excuse me for a sec. I just realized I did not keep anything out to keep time. And I am trying to squeeze in 15 years of research into this 45 to 50-minute presentation. So I'm going to, here and there, keep track of time to be sure that we're on track. So I want to thank you all again for being here. For me, there are two things that make this talk really special. One is that I get to speak to so many different stakeholders and people who care about urban education, not just researchers, but teachers and policymakers and community members. And that is really my goal as an academic. The other one is that even though I've been an academic for 18 years, this is my first book. So it feels like I was saying so that's a great thing for me. I want to talk really briefly how I got into this line of research. I was a high school English teacher, and as such, I love the variety of literature I got to teach. And I love the variety of English dialects that were in the literature I got to teach. Everything from Toni Morrison to Harper Lee to Zora Neale Hurston. I loved that as an English teacher, and I really appreciated the way language could be a window into humanity. But at the same time, I became increasingly aware of how language is one of the most insidious forces of discrimination in the United States. And I say insidious because I think we often don't talk about it and we don't acknowledge it, particularly in the English classroom. And so that is another part of what brought me to this work that I think is really important. I think you'll see that thread throughout. I always want to start my talks with, and I think it's important to acknowledge my own linguistic privilege. I'm privileged in many ways. I identify as white, middle class, I have a PhD, but added to that privilege is also my linguistic privilege. I speak a language that's one of the most privileged in the world, English, and I speak a variety of that language, a dialect of that language, that has led me to rarely face discrimination based on the way I speak. And that is not true for many of our students. And so acknowledging our own privileges in many ways, including linguistic, I think is a very important part of this one. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of insight into what I experienced at the beginning of my research trajectory with the way language is taught in schools and the way that students and teachers experience that. In one of my early studies, I noticed these two different views of language in a really common activity in English language arts classes called daily oral language or daily language practice. So what happens in this activity is that the teacher writes a sentence on the board that has errors in it of written standardized English. So in this case, it's Romeo sneaks into the Capulets party, him and Juliet see each other and fall in love. The students are expected to correct the sentence and go up to the front of the class and explain their corrections. My own research, other research has shown that this has absolutely no effect on students' understanding of academic written grammar or their own writing. Nevertheless, very common practice. So in this particular case, I saw a really important distinction between how Ms. West, the white teacher in this classroom, and Maisha and her classmates, who are all black, interpreted and thought about language. So in this situation, Maisha said to her friend, who was sitting next to her, I think you're supposed to erase comma after sneaks and put a semicolon after party and put a comma after, and her friend says, why don't you go up there? And she says, because man, this is something. I ain't going nowhere. And the teacher overhears this. And the teacher, Ms. West, says, you ain't going nowhere? And Maisha says to the teacher, I ain't going nowhere. And the teacher says, even more slowly, in front of the whole class, you ain't going nowhere. And Maisha says to her, I mean, I'm in my seat right now, Ms. West. If I stand up in front of you, I'll talk, speak proper, whatever you call it. But I'll speak in proper slang right now. So this really, to me, shows the very different views about language and dialects that is often portrayed by teachers, by mainstream curriculum, by the schools, as there being only one proper form of English that we all need to use at all times. On the other hand, we see Maisha's view of language and language variation, which is what is proper depends on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. And in fact, Maisha's view is much more aligned with all the research on linguistics we know, all the research we know on dialects. And so the question remains to me then, why do we keep teaching about language and dialects in these ways in our schools when it doesn't align with research or the way most people experience dialect diversity and language? So I spent some years after that looking at students' perceptions of language. And I think it's really important to think about how students themselves, who are multi-dialectal, who speak more than one dialect, view themselves and view the way they use language. What I saw in my interviews with students and my work in schools, and predominantly African American schools, was that students had much more complex linguistic identities than we had assumed. They had students talked about multiple ways of using language in multiple situations, just as Maisha did. Students also felt that they faced linguistic discrimination, not just in schools, but outside of schools. And sometimes with white peers or customers or teachers, assuming that the students only spoke one way or identified in one way linguistically. So Rich, one of the students I worked with, talked about his job at the Science Center here in Pittsburgh. And in this, he talks about how his white peers at the Science Center made assumptions about him based on his racial background, the way he speaks. He says, I used to have a job at the Science Center and I knew someone there. We was all cool and everything. The way I talk around them is different from the way I talk about around my friends. They ask, this means his white peers, how do you really talk? I will talk to them, but they just think I'm someone who's totally different. They don't even know who I am. They just think who I am at work is different from who I really am. And this theme of not having their complex linguistic and racial and professional identities acknowledged, particularly by white peers and teachers, came up over and over again in our work and our interviews with students. Many of the students worked and they had multiple stories about how white customers would speak to them in some way that they thought was some approximation of what linguists call African American English, and how insulting that was and unprofessional it was. And I'll show later teachers had similar experiences. We also asked students about their views on using different dialects in the classroom. And what we found was that students had really actually quite a range of views. But most students felt that teachers who insisted that they speak standardized English all the time in their English classrooms were oppressing them or trying to change them. Martin said, if a teacher would tell me I couldn't speak slang in the classroom, I would feel she was trying to change me. Jeff added, I believe we should be allowed to speak the way we normally talk. Now, we may be different with a speaker or a guest, but on a regular basis, that wouldn't feel right. So why should we have to go through that? Slang is our language that we speak. If you don't think it's right, that's your problem. Now, I'm happy afterward to talk about some of the terms that students used and teachers used for different dialects. Here, the students are using the term slang to talk about the way they speak with their friends. Linguists would probably call it African American English, but I'm happy to talk about that, about the issue of terminology, which I think is really important during the question and answer. So I want to present another kind of vision of reimagining dialects and identity among youth. This doesn't come from my research. This comes from Django Paris's research, but this is a new line in research, and I think it's important if we're thinking about reimagining dialects and identity to think about what's happening in extremely international and diverse communities. Django Paris's research was conducted in the Bay Area around San Francisco. And what he found in his research in a very diverse, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic school was that what he called African American English was a language that was shared by all the youth in the school, no matter their linguistic, ethnic, racial background. And this was seen as a form of community among the students and their sense of community identity as they fought against oppression both in the school and in their area. So you can see here that Carlos, who identifies as Latinx, talks about how English learners who come to the school learn informal varieties of English first before they're learning formal, or what people call standardized English. And so that's like their first language in English. And then Miles, who identifies as Black, was asked, does it bother you that students who are Samoan or Mexican American use features of African American English? And he said, no, we're all in this together. This is about us as a community. And similarly, Ella, who's Samoan, says similarly that the language that the youth in the school speak signifies their sense of community in the face of oppression. Similar research right now is coming out of England, where researchers have found that in major urban centers like London, youth tend to speak, no matter what their racial, linguistic, ethnic background, students tend to speak a dialect of English that they call urban youth dialect, that has its roots in Caribbean, African languages, and in Punjabi. So moving back to the US, what is the issue we're facing here? What is, in addition to differences between how students and teachers envision language, dialects, and power, what are the other issues about dialects in schools? Well, we have a few different ones going on concurrently. One is, if you look up the upper left, particularly in language arts, we teach literature that represents lots of different dialects of English, and we tell students it's powerful and wonderful and a great reflection of the author's skill. And then when students use similar features in their own talk, we tell them that that's wrong and that's not proper English. So we're giving students very mixed feelings. Educators also promote incorrect information about the way language works, such as ain't isn't a word. Ain't is a word. People use it, it has meaning, it is a word. And then we have the language surrounding dialects. Really proper, speak proper English, which implies to students that there's only one correct variety of English, when we know from linguistics, every variety is grammatical and patterned. As Derek said, we know that teachers and educators make snap judgments about students who speak vernacular dialects of English. That's been shown time and time again. So we know that students who speak dialects like Appalachian English, Chicano English, African American English, they are judged unfairly by their teachers and are assumed to have lower academic expectations. And then finally, we know that the way we teach about language is totally ineffective. We teach through things like worksheets, daily oral language, and comments like, does that sound right? Well, if you speak multiple dialects in your life, then a lot of grammatical patterns sound right because they are right in different parts of your life. So we have all these issues coming together in terms of how we handle, how we respond to dialect diversity in schools. So that's kind of the background to the problem and how my work kind of helped me see what some of the issues were that were going on in schools. My next step was, and what the book is really about, is so then what do we do about it? What do we do beyond documenting this project? How do we change curriculum? How do we change instruction? And in this book, we reimagine grammar, language, dialect instruction in English classes through an approach we call critical language pedagogy. And critical language pedagogy is based on a few principles. The first is that it's based in research. It's based in research from linguistics about how language actually works. And some of the ways language actually works are all languages have multiple dialects, and we all speak a dialect. That is a truth about language that we rarely talk about in schools. All dialects follow grammatical patterns. Dialects may follow patterns that are different from each other, but they all follow grammatical patterns. And finally, that the dialect that's most prestigious in society, what I've been calling standardized English, is based in social and cultural power and prejudice. Standardized English is not considered the prestigious variety because it's more grammatical. It's because it's the variety of English that was historically spoken by white upper class folks in the US. The curriculum also has students and teachers question negative assumptions about dialects, explore the relationships between language identity, power, and privilege. And then I think what's really important is that it includes action for linguistic justice. So it's not enough for students and teachers to learn about this issue, but what would you do to actually change it? What would you do to change language attitudes based in racism or other forms of prejudice? So as we thought about how we would teach teachers to enact this, a kind of a classic distinction in educational research came to mind. And that's the difference between content knowledge, so knowing the background knowledge on a subject, and pedagogical content knowledge, knowing how to actually teach that, how to explain it, how to assess it, how to know what students are going to understand or not understand. And this proved to be really, really important in what we found out about how teachers learn about dialects. So under content knowledge, we had a bunch of the principles in the last slide about how language and dialects operate. But under pedagogical content knowledge, we really want to help teachers think about how can you incorporate this into how you're teaching about reading, writing, listening, and speaking, which are considered the 4 language arts. So this, don't worry about this slide right now, because that pretty much just talks about the content. But the goals for the curriculum and the approach that we taught to teachers were to view students' language use as a resource for learning academic forms of English. So you're always adding to, you're always building on students' use and understanding of language. Valuing linguistic diversity, using open-ended discussions, empowering students to make informed choices, to have self-determination about how they want to use language in particular situations. And then creating opportunities for students to learn the language of power without giving up their home language varieties or other varieties they speak. This is just a really quick overview of what the course looked like. Everything about the course can be found in chapter 2 of the book, the entire curriculum. We started with what we thought would be most familiar to English teachers, and that was teaching about dialects and literature. And we sequenced the course that moved to what we thought would be most difficult, particularly for white teachers, who we know make up the majority of teachers in US schools and urban schools, and that's language and discrimination. So we thought about how to sequence these topics so that they would go from most understandable to most difficult. In each of those modules, we wanted to be really, really grounded in teaching. So every single one was focused around a teaching scenario. What would you do with this in your class? We also really tried to focus on online videos of teaching and interactive materials for the teachers. And I want to show you just a really quick clip. This occurred covered in our last unit on language and discrimination, when we talked about linguistic profiling. And in this, we took an article that was written about people, refugees from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, who sought housing in other communities and states, such as Texas, and the linguistic discrimination that Black people, not white people, faced when they called to try and rent apartments and get housing. So that is also a topic that has been studied by John Bogg, who's a linguist at Stanford University, based on his own experience with linguistic discrimination and housing in the San Francisco area. So we asked teachers to think about not just what the point of this video is, which I'm about to show you, but how would they teach it in their class, and what would they want their students to learn from it? So it might take a couple clicks, but I'm going to play you this 30-second housing and urban development clip.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park
It's
Street.
not available.
I use a wheelchair.
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call us.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name,
So that's a quick clip. I can show you other parts of the curriculum if you'd like. So when we implemented this curriculum in teacher education programs, we implemented in 11 programs across the country, and with over 300 teachers. And to give you a sense of teachers' responses to it and what we learned, these are the 3 questions we were looking at. How did teachers develop this critical approach to teaching about language and dialects through the course? What differences do we see by teachers' linguistic, racial, and regional identities? And how did the teachers talk about race and racism in connection to language? I'll skip over this quickly. This is a table of the different schools. As you can see, they range from Northeast to Southern to Western to Midwestern. They were all over the U.S. To answer the first question, how did teachers develop this critical approach to teaching about language and dialects? In this case, we did a case study of one particular class. And in this class, all the student teachers were white. And most of them had grown up in suburban, fairly homogeneous areas. And we were looking at across the course, what kind of knowledge did we see them developing from the beginning of the first unit to the end of the last unit? Both in terms of background knowledge about sociolinguistics, but also in terms of how they would teach. So, to give you a sense of, this is quick quantitative data, because all of our studies were mixed methods. We looked at the 6 elements of content knowledge about dialects that we wanted the teachers to develop. And we looked at how much they talked about those topics. So that's this, how much. And then we looked at how accurate or specific their talk was. And that's the score we gave. We had a 4-point score for that. So for content knowledge, you can see there are 2 really clear clusters. The student teachers talked mostly about what they were most comfortable with and what they were most knowledgeable about. All dialects are valid, language varies by context, and language can be a basis for judgment. They were much less likely to talk about and weren't as specific about things like language and identity being connected in the lives of their students, and language varying by social category. And by social category here, we meant by cultural, ethnic, racial background. Here, when we looked at how teachers were planning to teach about dialects, we found a more complicated kind of picture here. What they talked about the most wasn't always necessarily what they knew the most about. However, one thing that really stood out to us is that teaching about white privilege and systems of power as inherent in language attitudes and prejudices, that students were much less likely, student teachers were much less likely to talk about and were not as specific about. And then I'll show you how we kind of delved more into that. Across the course, though, we did see this movement among most of the teachers from this sense of approaching dialects as tolerance to thinking about social justice. So for instance, in the first module, Monica says, I'll just read the second part, teaching empathy and understanding alongside of a dialect-related lesson could be beneficial. However, it would be essential to avoid a seemingly oppressive pity when discussing difference. So we see here that she's really kind of struggling with this negative deficit view of dialect diversity. Whereas here in the fourth module, Haley said, after learning about linguistic discrimination, it's important that students from any background become aware that there's not one correct dialect or way of speaking. I think the more people who are educated to understand that dialects are all legitimate varieties of a language, the fewer instances of discrimination based on dialects will occur. So we tended to see this movement across the class. So that was our first round of teaching this curriculum. We thought, okay, something's going right here. We're seeing some progress. We then delved in more to some of the qualitative research to try and find out how are teachers' backgrounds shaping how they're thinking about this topic and how they'll teach about dialect diversity in urban schools. And to answer this question, we looked across 3 different programs. And we looked at programs across regions too, to get a better sense of whether we'd see a difference between Southern and Midwestern teachers. And so we've had a couple of interesting findings. The first was that we found that teachers at the Southern universities tended to talk about linguistic discrimination, race, and racism more than teachers at the Midwestern university. And that was statistically significant. And we tried to figure out why. And I think this gave us some insights into tackling this issue more in the future. These particular universities were in cities that were more diverse, the universities themselves were more diverse, and the teacher education programs were more diverse, as opposed to the Midwestern programs we studied. The second reason had to do with the teachers' personal experiences with linguistic discrimination. All of the teachers in the Southern universities reported having been discriminated against because of the dialect of English they spoke. And here are a couple of examples. On the left is a quote from Juliet, who was at a Southern university and who identified as white. And what we saw in her comment and a few other of the Southern teachers' comments is that there was a pride in speaking a Southern dialect, but there was also this sense of Southern but not too Southern. And so here Juliet says, my mom speaks like a Southern belle rather than the country dialect of Northeast Georgia, where she grew up picking cotton. And she learned that it would be a marker of judgment if she held on to that world from her youth. And then on the right, Kayla, who identified as Black, talked about her experience at work with a white coworker, doing what I had mentioned that some of the students in our studies had experienced, which was having a white coworker who tried to talk Black to connect with her. She's not sure what. She wrote, I believe my coworker, when using "would it be like," was making an ill attempt to relate to me on a Black level. It didn't work. Here, We delved more into, I'm going to talk about teachers' racial and linguistic backgrounds, as well as how the teachers in our study in general talked about race and racism in connection with how they would teach about dialects. And I want to quickly acknowledge Christina Ashwin, who I just saw a second ago, my doctoral student, well, former, because she defended her dissertation in the summer, but who did a lot of this work for us. And actually, I'm going to share a little bit from her dissertation research, too, on this data set. So in this analysis of teachers' response to teaching about dialects critically, we looked at, in particular, that fourth part of our curriculum that looked at linguistic profiling and linguistic discrimination, and looked at how teachers talked about that. So I first want to talk about some of the trends we saw among the teachers of color who participated in our study, particularly Black teachers. We saw this very explicit acknowledgement of power structures, of race and racism in society, and also a very pragmatic approach. And what Jasmine says, I think, is just so insightful. She says, I agree that these types of lessons can definitely be utilized in secondary classes. I think that code switching is getting a bad name sometimes. We all do it throughout the day with different people. I know that I don't talk to my parents the same way I talk to my sisters. I would think that students already know to use this skill without really paying attention to it. I understand the hesitation or fear of placing standard English as the most powerful form of English, but what is the alternative? I visualize CEOs taking lessons in Chicano, Appalachian, African American vernacular English. That would be the ideal, for everyone to share the burden of responsibility of understanding one another. But I don't see that happening. So the alternative is to play the game and learn the language of those in power. Another trend we saw in the discussions of teachers of color was this sense of their own positionality, which I'll show you was really different from the white teachers, where for many of the teachers of color, Black teachers in particular, it didn't occur to them that their students would ever think they were disrespecting the way that their students spoke, because they shared a bond, they shared a racial identity. And you'll see later that was really fraught for the white teachers in our study. Here Sheila says, for me, the most difficult task will be finding a way to validate students' dialects and still teach standard English. I didn't realize the importance of validating how they speak. I would never put a student down for his dialect, but I didn't realize this is a valuable conversation. Although I understand the findings that support that neither the dialects of the more affluent or underprivileged is correct, I am still charged with teaching standard English because it is what's accepted in the market. We also looked at multilingual teachers who spoke languages in addition to English, and found that for that group of teachers, their understanding of how they would teach about language variety and dialects in their classroom was very much influenced by their own personal experiences. So Lynn, who was born and raised in China, said, look, everyone assumes in China that you will use the same school-based dialect. No one even discusses it. I would not let my students ever use a vernacular dialect in my classroom. That's not what I did in school. Whereas Veronica, who was born and raised in the US but was bilingual and of Mexican descent, for her, understanding of linguistic privilege and dialect diversity and identity came to her not through feeling discrimination against the way she used English, but the way she used Spanish. And going back to Mexico and having a little girl tell her that her Spanish sounded funny. And it was like a farmer. It was like country Spanish. Turning now to some of the trends we saw in how white teachers engaged in this curriculum. I want to say, like, part of the reason I'm making this distinction is I think that we, perhaps in teacher ed, need to acknowledge that our students are starting in different places on this topic with different knowledge, experiences, identities, and I don't think we've done that yet in teacher education when we talk about preparing teachers for dialectically diverse classrooms. So looking at how teachers talked about dialect discrimination, dialect diversity in their classroom, Christina and I found that what we saw mostly was this color mute talk, which is basically, let's not talk about race and racism. We're not comfortable with it, and this led to kind of this overgeneralizing about discrimination in language. So for instance, we all code switch. Linguistic profiling happens to all people, no matter their race. So we get this very colorblind kind of denial that linguistic privileges exist. Christina put together this list of many of the other terms white teachers used instead of talking about race, racism, culture, diversity. So we saw in a number of different analyses a real avoidance of talking about the role of race and racism in linguistic discrimination. Finally, we also saw this just incredible sense of fear when talking about this issue. Terms that they used were difficult, delicate, complicated, touchy to talk about dialect diversity or dialects and power. I'm going to read the last quote because I think it's worth reading. Monica wrote, "I'm a white body teaching language politics to a group of African American students. There's a lot of pressure to make things feel right. I wouldn't ever want to insult my students or make them believe that I was not on their side or that I was harboring discrimination against their home languages. Power is a difficult and tricky topic to explore, considering its depth and its pervasive potential. Teaching this concept to a group of white rural students would, I imagine, be less daunting for me. Of course, I don't want to eliminate conversations simply because I'm afraid of the impact or implications, but I'd want to be careful." So I think we can see here just that incredible sense of fear, of kind of acknowledging her racial positioning as a white teacher, but also not knowing what to do with it. So in Christina's dissertation, she found that a small but vocal number of teachers in our study exhibited what we called critical race talk. So talking about dialect diversity, race, and racism in very critical ways. And one of the themes that Christina found was this theme of kind of their own racial identity and positioning. In a slightly different way from the previous slide, Monica, for whom this was very scary. For these teachers, it was a fact of how they would act as teachers and how their students would interpret them, and how they needed to kind of check themselves as teachers. So Belle says, "I will have to be careful that my own upbringing and speaking patterns do not make me favor those students who are similar to me, and I'll have to pay close attention to ensure I'm not leaving anything out simply because it's outside of what I've experienced." And Catherine talks about listening to the stories of her students who may have experienced linguistic profiling and linguistic discrimination. And in doing that, trying to change the cycle of linguistic discrimination. The other thing that teachers who showed critical approaches to language and dialects in their classrooms tended to do is they tended to assume that their classrooms would be linguistically diverse. That's what they pictured when they pictured themselves as teachers. And here you see both Adam and Catherine talked about not taking like a cookie cutter approach, not making assumptions about students' linguistic experiences or their use of different dialects, but getting to know their students and hearing what they had to say. So after we looked at what the teachers said about their own positioning as teachers, we looked at their responses. Sorry, let me be clear about this. We examined how they responded to a question about how they would teach a particular poem that we shared called Listen, Mr. Oxford Don, which is a fabulous poem. It's written by John Aggard, who's a Guyanese British poet, and it's about language discrimination and colonization. I highly recommend it. And so we asked them, what would your goal be as a teacher? What would you want students to get out of this poem? And from this, we saw both positives and negatives. On the positive side, you can see that about 60%, 56% of the teachers mentioned that they would want the poem, teaching the poem, to accomplish the purpose of teaching about discrimination and working against linguistic discrimination. However, about 43% of teachers only saw this as an opportunity to talk about either the poet's craft, the use of symbolism and line breaks, or about celebrating differences, but not talking about the themes of discrimination and colonization. So even at the end of our course, we saw that it seemed like for a bit over 50% of the teachers, they were moving toward these critical understandings of language, but there were other teachers who were still seeing this as an opportunity to celebrate difference. So to kind of sum up here what we learned and what we're thinking about moving forward, and hopefully like as an invitation to questions and comments from you all, the first thing we learned, which was really important, was that the teachers did have pretty strong knowledge about how dialects and language operate. They were not, we rarely saw a teacher say something like, well, only standard English is grammatical. We rarely saw that. So that was really helpful. However, I'm going to jump to the bottom point here. Even in the face of that, even in the face of like accurate knowledge about dialects and how they operate, teachers had a really, really hard time moving from that to how they would teach. So one of the questions we asked teachers was, we gave them a real piece of student writing that used, that within the writing had a lot of features of vernacular dialect. And we said, how would you talk to the student about this? What would you say? And we found that about 70% of the teachers avoided the question. Just avoided the question, just said, I would talk to them about their thesis. And we kind of set up the question, so we said, you've already talked about the thesis, you've already talked about the organization, how would you talk about language? And it was really clear that was very difficult for teachers to imagine. What would I actually say face to face to the students? And then a number of teachers just said, I don't know. I really don't know what I would say. Secondly, we did see that regional, racial, and linguistic identities shape teachers, both their talk and their acknowledgement of issues of identity and power surrounding the teaching of dialects. So we saw that Black teachers tended to acknowledge the racism that exists across society in dialect attitudes, but also had this very pragmatic view of teaching about standard English. This is my job. This is, this is what I'm expected to do. This is how I help my students get through the gates of standardized tests, of college admissions and such. White teachers, on the other hand, tended to avoid talking about or talking about teaching about identity and power, and had this sense of tension and fear around talking about their own racial and linguistic privilege. And then finally, the last point I want to raise, which I haven't talked about as much, is that in terms of instructional strategies, we had the teachers fill out a survey at the beginning of the study with various aspects of their identity including their linguistic identity, racial, gender, everything. And then we looked at some of the instructional strategies that the teachers chose. And interestingly, the aspect of their background that was most connected with a critical approach was describing their peer group growing up and their current peer group as diverse. More than their individual identity was having a diverse group of friends. So we're not sure what to make of that yet, but it came up and it was a finding that arose in a couple of our analyses. So what does this mean in terms of reimagining dialects in schools? I've kind of broken this up into two parts. What does it mean for teachers and what does it mean in classrooms? And I think for teachers, it certainly means, and I know this is something that we all believe in, but it's another study that shows how important it is that we diversify the teaching force. The teachers in our study who went through our curriculum in all white or predominantly white cohorts, they did not develop the critical perspectives that the teachers in more diverse cohorts did. And they also were more afraid to talk about these important issues with their students. So we see that as really compelling evidence for why we need more teachers of color in English classrooms. We also found that we absolutely have to focus teacher ed more around dialects on pedagogical applications. We have to talk about teaching, not just about linguistic research. We have to give teachers more really specific strategies for thinking about how do you teach written standardized English in a way that is useful and that doesn't denigrate the other varieties of English that students speak. Teachers believe that. They seem to believe that, but they didn't know how to do it. And then finally, we really saw a diversity in where teachers were, depending on their linguistic and racial backgrounds. And I think that's also something we need to think about more in teacher education. Teachers may need different things. They may be at different points of development in terms of thinking about dialects. In terms of classrooms, what we found both with the teachers and in our earlier studies is that we tend to teach about dialects through literature. And when we do that, it's really easy to dismiss. So when people read in, say, To Kill a Mockingbird, when Jem and Scout are very prejudiced and racist against the way Calpurnia speaks in her church, kids can say, and they do say, well, that was then, right? That was then, that's not now. And so we found that teaching about current issues made it come alive. It made teachers, students kind of take up these issues in much more robust and motivated ways. We found just a lot of miscommunication between teachers and students about even why teachers thought they should teach standardized English. And so we advocate for a lot more open, explicit discussions about students' background experiences, their linguistic traumas, as well as their linguistic identities. These are things that need to be discussed. They can't be assumed, either on the part of teachers or students. Acknowledging diversity in students' identities and dialect use, we found that teachers often assumed that students had like one type of identity as a language user. That was not true. Students had much more complex identities, I think, than we thought, or the teachers we work with thought. And the last point I want to leave you with is, why just urban? So I think in much of the scholarship around teaching about dialect diversity, there's a focus on urban schools. But why aren't we teaching about dialect diversity in all schools? Because that is the way English actually works. To me, it would be like saying we should only teach multicultural literature in urban schools. That wouldn't make any sense. We believe that it's valuable to everyone in our society, to all students, to learn about a variety of perspectives. Equally, I would argue that we need to, not just as teachers, but also as researchers, move into other schools too. Predominantly white, rural, and and suburban schools and ask students there and teachers there to take up this work and think about the consequences of not teaching linguistically privileged students the real way that language operates. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for
just sitting here thinking about the classroom environment in terms of making these transitions into the space and dealing with these issues. Certainly this hegemony, the class hegemony that's associated with language is a global issue, especially around English. It's perceived that you will get better jobs if you're Chinese and you speak English really well, that you're very fluent in English. And then I'm also thinking about how do you create a classroom environment as a safe space, building trust to do this kind of work, because what I've heard in your presentation was that they were taking on parts of it, but there was a reluctance on some of the teachers because they didn't have necessarily the tools to create the classroom community to build a safe space to do this kind of work.
Yeah. So in the first part where you used class, did you mean social class?
Yeah, social
Okay.
class.
I thought so. I just wanted to be sure that you didn't mean classroom. Yes, I mean, there's certainly a social class part of this that comes through, particularly in the Southern students, I think, responses to the Southern teachers' responses to the curriculum and the distinction between Southern Belle and, being two countries. I don't know a particular way to focus on that except to say that I think it needs to be part of the conversation so that we're talking about all aspects of linguistic discrimination. To answer your second question, what we saw in our work with teachers, predominantly white teachers in predominantly African American schools, was that trust, that community you're talking about, was much stronger when there were first open discussions about dialects, power, prejudice. One teacher who we've written about quite a bit, I'm trying to remember the pseudonym we gave her. I can only think of her real name. But we've written about her quite a bit. And she started really the school year with talking about the different languages students spoke, and that she did. She grew up quite poor in rural Iowa, and she shared with her students her own feelings of linguistic discrimination, and even this instance where her husband had made fun of her for talking very formally to the pastor in church. And the students were like, yeah, that is funny. But we would have done the same thing too if we were talking to our pastor. So I think I know in some ways I feel like it sounds like a cliche to say that those open conversations about linguistic identity and dialects and power need to happen, but we saw firsthand how they created a totally different class community once the English teacher went to teach about, say, subject-verb agreement in academic writing. There was this trust that the reason she is teaching us this is to help us become better academic writers. She's not trying to impose her idea of what she thinks proper English is because she's white and it's the way she speaks. Is that?
I think that answers, some of it. Yes. It's a difficult issue to navigate the space in the classroom, especially in discussing white privilege and linking that to linguistics.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that as an African American secondary English teacher, I think that your work definitely resonates with me because some of your quotes, it's clear you had clear saturation because I'm thinking, I've seen that and I've heard that. Like I have examples of where a student says ain't and another teacher will say to me, aren't you going to correct them? Or someone will say to me, yeah, I got my hair did, last weekend. Aren't you going to correct them, Lisa? No, I'm not. And it's only because I had the education and the background to know the difference in the language of power and what it was to discriminate based on one's language. But it is frustrating at times as a teacher when I would have people, they don't do that to me now because I've voiced my opinion and I've shared, the research behind it. But in my early stages, it was definitely a struggle to deal with that. Luckily, I had the confidence to say, no, I'm not. But now the struggle I have is I will have teachers come to me after they hear something like this, and now they're timid and they're anxious because they're afraid to correct a student when they write an essay. And they say, Lisa, can I change the sentence structure because they said I'd be going to the store? And I'm like, well, it's a formal essay. It's written in standard English. You're training them to write an essay for college. That's okay. But now they're very timid and afraid.
Yeah, okay, I need to work with you. Can we exchange information afterward? Because I think that's exactly where we are in this research too. Both trying to battle that deficit point of view, like why aren't you going to correct ain't, but then also to help teachers get over that timid thing that you were talking about too. Like you still have a job to do, and part of that job that students and parents, at least in our research and other research, are expecting you to do is to also teach what you called the language of power. I think that's the term you used. Yeah. So it would be, let's talk.
Was most of this work done with high school teachers? Because I wonder how that filters down to elementary and, because kids certainly notice, kindergarten and first grade, the differences in the way people speak in class. And so how do you start the conversation with younger children also?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, so my research is mostly on high school, but one of the things that we found in our research, and I think is true at an elementary age too, is that the literature on code switching, teaching about code switching, I actually find that to be very deficit oriented. In that, I think that a lot of the people who originate with that assume that students don't already know that they're code switching, and certainly in our high school studies, the students were like, of course we know that we're switching the way we speak in different situations. And my hunch is the same in elementary too. And I find that elementary, and some of you are nodding, so you please contribute, because I just find that even at the elementary level, there's this assumption that you have to teach kids who speak multiple dialects that they each have, that they're contextual. I'm not convinced we have to teach that.
No, my own experience is just seeing how kids switch the way they speak. They really early on. They learn.
And if you think about the research on multilingual speakers, it's the same. Like there's research on very young kids, like 4 years old, who speak multiple languages, and they know, I speak French with you because you're my dad. I speak Spanish with you because you're my teacher. I mean, kids know this at a very early age. And so I take that research to be problematic.
I was curious what your opinion was on terminology, what you had brought up before, just in terms of African American vernacular English, or even Chicano, or all these other terms that we put on different dialects that are supposed to be variations of what we consider to be standardized English. And just like my personal opinion, that's like, okay, well, yes, like as a person of like, it's nice to have something that's affirming, that says like, oh, the way that I speak has a name, and this is something that people say, and I can identify with this. So I think there's a strength in being able to say like, oh, there's an African American vernacular English, or there's a Chicano English. But at the same time, I feel like it's very othering, because it's still saying that this is a variation of the proper way to speak. And so I was just wondering what your opinion was in terms of like academically, we always have to have words to identify what we're talking about, but then like how does that actually end up, you know, when we generalize that into actual society, when we're out of academia, what type of messages are those sending our kids where it's like, well, you speak Chicano or you speak African American vernacular, and like what is that really saying, as opposed to just saying you speak the way that you speak. So I was just curious what your opinion was on that.
That is such an important topic, and I'll just say at the outset, like, I don't have a good answer. Like, this is like it's something that keeps me up at night, because I think all the terms that we use have pros and cons. I mean, I think some are better than others. And I think that, for instance, the term African American language, which is used by some linguists, I think what's nice about that term is by using the word language is not setting up this comparison to standard English and African American English. And I think the other problem with the term, two other problems with the terms, I have more problems than solutions, is that, you know, sometimes they mask diversity within a dialect. So, you know, what linguists have called Chicano English, what some linguists are now calling Latinx English, it differs from New York to California. It doesn't have the same grammatical structures or accents. So there's this way in which the labels we give can be helpful, but they kind of create random demarcations and othering. The second problem, which I think I have like come to a better place on, is not imposing terms on students. So when some of the students I worked with used to call the way they spoke ghetto, you know, the first thing I'd want to do is say like, oh my gosh, that sounds really negative, don't say that. But what I found is with some of the teachers we worked with, the best way to talk about the terminology for language was to ask the students, what does that term mean to you? What does that term mean to you? And with one group of students, that led to this incredible discussion about how ghetto doesn't mean bad. Ghetto means you're in a segregated urban neighborhood. And one of the students was like, yeah, because ghetto started with the Jews when they were, you know, segregated in Nazi Germany. Like, ghetto talks about segregation. It's not saying that we don't think the way we speak is worse. So in terms of the problem of terminology with students in the actual teaching, I found that asking about the terminology they themselves use, I hope allows students that kind of self-determination. You get to label how you speak, because it's how you speak. In terms of how we talk to like the wider public and teachers about it, I'm still figuring that out. If you have any good ideas, I'd appreciate it, because I do think almost every term can be both affirming and othering at the same time.
The SATs and ACTs and college essays, they all expect that kind of formal English, that kind of like correct the sentence to make it sound right, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And how do you, how do you discuss with your students that, hey, you're going to come up against this form of discriminatory, like, standard English that you're going to have to engage with? How do you have that conversation with them without basically kind of being like, the world sucks, like, but you're gonna have to deal with it?
Yeah.
You know, like, how do you, I don't know, positively, or is there a way to positively kind of, or I don't know, like, empower them in a way to deal with the fact that they're going to have to engage with this?
So I've taken my cues from the teachers in our studies, who I feel like have been very wise about this, particularly the teachers of color. And we've called this in our research, this approach, strategic pragmatism, so that you're pragmatic about power structures in society and linguistic privilege at the same time that you're strategic. If you talk about it strategically, and how getting through some gates, like college admission, particular jobs, then gives you the power to rewrite the rules of language, then I think, to me, that's the most comfortable place to kind of talk to teachers about this. So again, I've tried to take my cues from the teachers and some of the parents. So there's been some research on parents, African American parents' views about dialect diversity. So after the Oakland School Board Ebonics decision, when there was this made national news about teaching code switching and multiple dialects, John Ogbu did a study of African American parents in Oakland, California, and he interviewed, I think, over 100 families. So it was a pretty big study, and found that most parents felt it was the school's obligation to teach academic and professional varieties of English, while at the same time not denigrating or erasing students' other ways of using language. So.
I just want to share to the point you were making. When I was working with a high school context, I would talk about language as basic. I don't say formal, I say basic. In the basic language, now I know because of systems of colonial oppression, has more mileage. It's basic. You can travel with it. And now I know that it travels because of colonialism, but you can travel with the basic. My home language is special. It is enhanced by my community. So it's more important. So I don't make it a deficit. So I'll say, well, let's get you some mileage. SATs, other places, let's get you some, let's use the standard of the basic because it travels in many, many places. But because of the rarefied air that's your house, it's home and it's special and it's enhanced in that way. And so it's not a deficit. I speak a rare language with rare people, and I think Barbara Sizemore says that she speaks the King's English around those who hate her, and she speaks her home language around those who love her. And so that's how she categorizes it. So.
Yeah, thank
I like
you.
that. Thank you, that was great.
Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to give one example of the richness of Black dialect or African American language that I experienced just a few weeks ago. I was at a baby shower with all African American girls, and one young woman came up to me and she said, "Dr. Wooten, I've been knowing you since I was 5." And I thought, that is so much more powerful than I met you when I was 5, because we've been in contact, we've remained close friends, and so it was great to say, I've been knowing you since I was 5. I thought about it all the way through. Powerful.
And that's a great example, because that is a verb form in African American English that carries a meaning that does not exist in standardized English. So it can express ideas and things that you can't even express in standardized English.
So have you done any of this work here in Pittsburgh looking at like regional differences? Because I know I sit on 61C and I'm like, what the heck are they talking about? Like, there's some people that speak some dialects around here.
Yeah, so this is not my study, and I didn't include it, but this is done by a research team in the linguistics department about Pittsburgh dialect. And so this is a little example of how I think, people often talk about Pittsburghese as things like yins, features like yins. And in Eberhard and Kiesling and Barbara Johnstone's work, people who do research on Pittsburgh dialect, what they found is that really some of these features are only spoken by white Pittsburghers. And there's this assumption, there's kind of this white supremacy inherent in the idea that this is a Pittsburgh dialect as opposed to a white Pittsburgh dialect. So in this data, this comes directly from their publication. This student, Daneen, says, we don't say yins. And you can see, she names the schools. She says, for real. I heard that first when I went to Brashear. And she goes on to talk about how she did not know if the white teacher was insulting her when she said yins. She did not know if it was if it was condescending. And so I think I actually gave a presentation for Pittsburgh Public a few years ago, and we kind of talked about this, and a number of the teachers were saying it never occurred to me that my Pittsburgh dialect would be unfamiliar to my students. So that was kind of a cool moment. But I think there is more variety, even within the city, than we acknowledge, and it's important too.
Can we give Dr. Godley a round of applause, please? We can talk about this all day, so I didn't want to take up too much time presenting you with a gift. So the talk was much more rich. So thank you very much. We appreciate having you all. And thank you all for coming.
I did finally want to hear the law. Because it was so funny, as a teacher from New Jersey, when I went down south and said yes ma'am, I was like, are you mocking me? Like, are you, because nobody would say yes ma'am unless you were being super sarcastic. It was like, and then it was like, and then I had to ask another teacher to make sure that they were listening to me, and they're like, oh no, every child should.
I got a question. What's it like, you know, because Linda missed her class? No, I'm studying race. What is it like to teach? No, it's no.
This is one with two
word sequences.
So they avoided it.
I was just reading something about English, how adjectives big, round, fair, and then you would never say brown, big, bear. And then, like, it's not intuitive. You know it's English speaking one, but and then I was like, oh my god, like, what have I been saying in Spanish? Have I been mixing it up? Or is that not totally because she hasn't heard it a million times yet, so it hasn't been like
But then
Yeah, well, it was
but you also I'm good. I was thinking like, shoot, I'm just yeah, exactly. Because literally, I just said, and I was like, thinking about it, but I don't know if we never actually.
No, we haven't got a deadline. That's why you're not.
That's the question. Oh, no worries. Yeah, I want to somehow you want to if it's two of us, you need 'll pray about it. I'm still like, I'm stuck on that part. I wish I could bring my dialects in right now.
The Native Americans.
It almost reinforces that point. You're speaking properly, but you're speaking my
wanted to make sure that so they're planning
all right, I'm glad there were certain people who did not attend.
I think if I wrote the word field work,
which is fine.